Hey guys, it's Chris from Highline Guitars, and you're watching another episode of From the Luthier's Workbench. In this episode, I'm going to demonstrate a finishing technique that I've developed, which mimics the look of a hand-rubbed oil finish, but without the use of any oil products. And I'm talking about stuff like boiled linseed oil, tung oil, oil-based wipe-on polyurethane, Danish oil, True Oil, those kind of products. Instead, what this technique relies on is the use of water-based finishing products. And I will put a link in the description below. All these products come from my friends at Crystal Lac. So check out those products if you're interested. And without further ado, I will walk you through this really simple technique so you can see how you can mimic the look of a hand-rubbed oil finish and do so very quickly with a water-based finish that doesn't have a lot of fumes and an easy cleanup, and one that dries very, very quickly.
The first step in this process is to sand all the surfaces where I'm going to be applying my finish. And typically that means I'll start out with about 100 grit sandpaper, and I'll work my way up through 150 and then finish with a 220 grit sandpaper. Now I'm using a random orbital sander here, but you could also do this work by hand. A random orbital sander will just save you a lot of time. Now, if you're going to use a random orbital sander, here's a couple of tips. First of all, you need to use a really high quality abrasive sanding discs. If you use the cheap stuff, there's a good chance that some of those abrasive grains are going to flake off, and that can cause those unsightly curly-Q pigtail scratches in the surface. Also, when using the sander, you don't want to apply too much downward pressure. You just want to use the weight of the sander itself. And then as you move the sander across the surface, move it very slowly. If you apply too much pressure and move it too rapidly over the surface, once again you're going to end up with those horrible looking curly-Q scratches in the finish. Now, as I said before, I'll use 100 grit first, and that's mainly to remove tool marks and deep scratches from the surface of the wood. Then I'll move up to 150, which will remove the sanding scratches left by the 100 grit, and then I'll finish with 220, which removes the sanding scratches left by the 150 grit. And then, of course, even though I'm using a random orbital sander, I still feel the need to do some sanding by hand, and this is mainly in hard to reach places or wherever there's a tight curve. And then once I'm finished sanding with the 220 grit, I like to look at the surface with a bright light held at a low angle. And what I'm looking for here are any flaws which might escape detection. Under normal shop lighting, it can be difficult to see scratches and dings and that sort of thing, tool marks. But they'll stand out once you start to apply finish. So by using a light this way, I can really see the surface quality. And then once I'm satisfied I have a perfect surface, the next step is going to be to apply a sanding sealer. And I usually just brush on the sanding sealer. And the product that I'm using is Crystal Lac's water-based sanding sealer. And there's really several reasons for applying a sanding sealer. First of all, as you're applying it, you can see it darkens the wood, and that helps you to see any surface flaws that might have escaped detection earlier, even with that bright light. That way I can let the sanding sealer dry if I encounter any additional flaws, and then go back in and retouch those areas with sandpaper. Another reason for using a sanding sealer is it will raise the grain, and we want to raise the grain now because we can then lightly sand it off with some 220 grit sandpaper before applying our stain. If we were to apply the stain now without using a sanding sealer, the stain itself would raise the grain, and when you try to sand it off, you'll also sand off some of the color. So the sanding sealer will also help raise that grain. And then the final reason for using a sanding sealer is the stain that we're going to use when applied to a surface that hasn't been sealed will cause the stain to lay down in kind of an inconsistent manner. When you look at a guitar body, you've got a combination of face grain as well as end grain. And right around that back side of the guitar, the back edge, there's a lot of end grain. There's also end grain around the front, and anywhere you have curves that are carved into the sides, you can get a combination of both face grain and end grain. And wherever you have face grain, the stain is going to lay down nice and consistent, but wherever you have open end grain, stain will lay down much, much darker. So if you don't put down a sanding sealer, you're going to end up with an inconsistent splotchy finish. You'll have areas where it's light and areas where it's dark. However, the sanding sealer will help promote the consistent application of the color stain. And of course, I'll treat the neck, headstock, and the fretboard the same way with the sanding sealer. And in truth, as far as the fretboard is concerned, that's kind of an option. It's really up to you whether or not to put any finish on the fretboard. In some cases, it's beneficial, but then in others, it may not be. I felt that in this case, putting the water-based fake oil treatment on the fretboard would actually enhance the wood grain. So I'm going to go ahead and apply the sanding sealer to the entire neck, the fretboard, and then I'll brush it over the surface of the fretboard, let it soak in. I'll let the sanding sealer dry for a couple of hours, and then I'll go back and lightly sand the surface with some 220 grit. This is done mainly to remove that raised grain so the surface will be nice and smooth for the next step. The key to this finish is the dye stain that I'm going to be applying to the wood. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix Crystalac Bright Tone Instrument Finish with Crystalac Warm Tone Dye Solution, which is a concentrated golden amber dye. And then I'm going to use Crystalac Retarder to slow down the drying process. And then I'm just going to mix it up in one of these small craft store plastic paint containers. And if you need to change the tint, you can also use Crystalac Craftnique color pigments, and they come in a wide variety of different colors, and all you have to do is add like a drop or two, and that can change the color of the stain. I'm only going to give you kind of a rough idea of how to mix up these ingredients because it's going to differ for everybody based on what you think is an attractive color. But what I'll do is I'll start with about 3 fluid ounces of Crystalac Bright Tone Instrument Finish. And then I'll add to that roughly half a tablespoon of the Crystalac Warm Tone Dye Solution. And then I'll finish off by adding about a half a tablespoon of the retarder. And then once I've got this all mixed up, I can then test it on scrap wood to kind of get an idea of what the color is going to look like. Now it's important to understand that when you're testing the product, once it dries, it will dry very flat and it will tend to look a lot lighter. Because what will happen is once you put a clear coat over the top of the dry dye, it will pop back to life and it will appear a little bit darker and a little bit more intense. So you just have to keep that in mind. And I think it's best to judge the color when it's wet, right after you've applied it to your scrap wood. And of course, as you test, you can add either more of the warm tone or more of the bright tone in order to get the color exactly the way you want it. And once I was satisfied with the color, I was ready to apply the dye stain first to the guitar body. And really, when you apply this, it's the same as applying any kind of a dye stain. I'm just going to use a clean cloth and then spread it around the surface. Now, one thing you need to remember is because this is a water-based product, and even though I did add the retarder to slow down the drying process, it will dry pretty quickly. So you don't want to spend too much time spreading the product around the surface, because if you do, it's going to start to tack up on you, because remember, the Crystalac Bright Tone that we used as a base is it's a binder basically, and it will start to dry. So you do want to work fairly quickly, but you do want to make sure that you apply the color consistently and evenly across the entire surface. Now, of course, the neck and fretboard are treated in the same way as the body was. And one thing you should keep in mind about using this water-based dye stain is that each coat that you apply is going to darken and intensify the color. So if you feel like it's too light on the first pass, you can always apply a second one, and you'll notice that it will get much darker and much more intense. So here you can see as I'm applying it to this neck, which was carved from a slab of bird's eye maple, it really does a nice job of popping out the bird's eye figure in this wood. Now, as I said before, applying this type of stain to the fretboard is optional, but as you can see, it really does a nice job of enhancing the color and grain in this wood. After applying the dye stain, we need to let it dry for a couple of hours, and then we need to make a decision. If you want the surface to be smooth, it may be necessary to fill the grain in the pores. Otherwise, if you don't mind the texture of the grain and pores, you can just leave it as is and proceed with the final steps. But if you're going to fill the grain, I would recommend using Crystalac water-based wood grain filler. And in the container, it looks like a thick white, almost pasty-like substance. But when you spread it thin on the surface, it will dry clear, and it will do a nice job of filling the grain. So you would want to apply one, maybe 2 coats, maybe even 3 coats, depending on the species of wood, in order to fill the grain. And then you would probably have to give it a light sanding with some 220 grit before proceeding with the final steps of applying the clear coat finishes next. Now, speaking of the final step of applying the clear coat finish, I'll be using Crystalac Bright Tone. And you can actually purchase this in a gloss finish or a matte finish. It just depends on what you want. In fact, you could probably mix the two if you wanted to. But I'm going to be using the matte because I don't want any glossy shine on this particular guitar. But I'm just going to mix up, again, it's about 3 to 3.5 ounces of the Bright Tone with just a small amount of the Crystalac Retarder, and that is added so that the Bright Tone will dry a little bit slower, and then I have a little bit more working time to apply it. And the way to apply it is pretty much the same way that you would apply, for example, a wipe-on polyurethane or a Danish oil or even True Oil. I'm just going to use a clean cloth, and I'll apply some of the Bright Tone Retarder mix to the cloth, and then I'm just going to wipe it onto the surface of the wood, making sure that I apply it as thin and as smooth as possible. And you don't want to apply it too heavily so that it runs down the sides. You just want enough to lay it down on the surface. And you want to also try to use your lighting overhead to help you to see the surface as you're applying it, so that you can make sure that you're laying it down as smooth as possible without any drag marks. Now, because I added the retarder to the Crystalac, that extended dry time will make it easier to apply. It'll also help flow out, so that after it's been applied, even if it does appear to be some rag marks, there's a good chance it's going to level out and dry pretty smooth. And then I'll just continue wiping it around the sides, and then I'll apply it to the back as well. And I'll do just 1 coat first, hang it up and let it dry for a couple of hours, and then if necessary, I'll continue and I'll add 2, maybe 3, maybe even 4 coats. I don't need to apply it really heavily, but I want to make sure that I have adequate coverage. And then, of course, the neck and fretboard are going to be treated in the exact same way. And as I said before, I'll hang up the guitar neck and the body and let those dry for a couple of hours before proceeding with additional coats. I'll let that first coat dry for about 2 to 3 hours, and then I'm going to lightly sand the surface with a Mirka Abralon 1000 grit sanding disc. And this will help to remove any dust nibs and rag marks which may be present in the surface before applying the next coat. As I sand the surface, I'll stop every so often and then carefully inspect the surface to make sure that it's nice and smooth before I apply my second coat. Each additional coat of my Brightone instrument finish will be applied exactly the same as the first one. I just want to make sure that I lay it down as smooth as possible.
After I had applied 4 coats of the Brightone, which was mixed with the retarder, I'm ready to let this guitar body and neck cure. And typically with Brightone, I recommend 1 day of cure time per coat. So 4 coats would mean 4 days. However, since I added the retarder, it's going to probably lengthen that time a little bit. So just to play it safe, I'm going to let it cure for a total of about 7 days. And then at that point, I'll be ready to glue in the neck and do the final assembly. I don't really need to do anything else with this finish. Since it's a matte sheen, I don't need to level sand, polish sand, and buff it. If I was going for a gloss sheen, I would have used Crystal Lacs Brightone in a gloss finish, and then I would have used, I would have probably gone with about 8 to 10 coats, and then let it cure for like 2 weeks. Then I would have level sand, polish sand, and buffed it out. But since I'm going for that hand rubbed oil finish look, I don't really need to do that. I'm going to stick with just the matte sheen, and once it's cured after 7 days, I'll be ready to do the final assembly. So hopefully this video has given you some ideas for your own water-based approach to mimicking a hand-rubbed oil finish. This is a faster way to achieve that kind of look. You end up with a finish that I think is a little bit more durable, and as far as like the rags are concerned, you don't have to worry about spontaneous combustion. You can just toss them into the trash, no big deal. And if you have any questions or comments, post those down below, of course. And hopefully you like this video enough to give me a thumbs up. I always appreciate that. And if you don't already subscribe, hit that subscribe button. And then next to it, you'll see that little bell icon. Click that. And then you'll be notified by email every time I post a new video, which is roughly once a week. So until the next episode, I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you soon.